Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's DICE Grand Rounds. This is really a special Grand Rounds. You're going to hear today from dynamic Dean Dayna Bowen Matthew, who really is here to talk to us and to help us learn more about how we in medicine can deliver better, just medicine. Just health for everybody, equitable care. I want to take a moment first. This is a hybrid Grand Rounds. Those on Zoom can feel free to put their questions in the Q&A and they will be answered as they come through. I'll be monitoring that. We will stop at the end for 10 minutes to answer any questions. So you please hang on to your questions until then. I want to also thank Kim Oster and the library management team for collaborating with the Department of Psychiatry in this special Grand Rounds. Tonight at 6 p.m., Dr. Dean Bowen will be presenting the Neely series at the Rush Reese Library, and it will be a presentation more to do with just health than just medicine. So it will be a different topic tonight, but it's all good. It's all in the same light of us wanting to deliver the best care we can in healthcare. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Dayna Bowen Matthew, JD, PhD, who is currently the Dean and Harold H. Green Professor of Law at George Washington University, a leader in public health and civil rights law who focuses on disparities in health, healthcare, and the social determinants of health. Dean Matthew joined George Washington Law in 2020. She is the author of the best-selling book, Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare, and the newly released Just Health, Treating Structural Racism to Heal America. Dean Matthew previously served on the faculty of the University of Virginia Law School, where she was co-founder and inaugural director of the Equity Center, a transdisciplinary research center that seeks to build better relationships between UVA and Charlottesville community through community engagement, scholarship, and partnership. Earlier in her career, Dean Matthews served at the University of Colorado Law School as professor, vice dean, associate dean of academic affairs. She was a member of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities there. Dean Matthew also has been on many public policy roles, and if I read her entire bio, we would be here for an hour. She's very impressive. She's a dynamic speaker, and we are so thrilled to have her and welcome her.
Sometimes you come to a place and you know you have found your people. That's how I feel about Telva. She picked me up this morning. I was late. And she said, "Oh, don't worry." I was like, "Oh, that's my people." And then when we got in the car, we started talking about our children. And I said, "I have a grandchild." She shows me her picture and I showed her my picture. I was like, "Oh, this is my people." And then when we got into the session this morning, we were having a roundtable discussion. And she said, physicians have to get down to legislators and tell them what we know. And I was like, oh my God, I just died and came to heaven here in Rochester. So I thank you very much, Dr. Olivares. I thank you, Zena Schubert, Zipporah Rosenberg, and the head of the department, Ben Lee. Thank you for the privilege of being here. It's pretty bold to invite a lawyer to Grand Rounds. I'm very excited. But I have to tell you that I'm going to make the most of this because I'm married to a doctor and I know what you guys think of me really already. I also know all the bad lawyer jokes. So I know, that the skunk and the lawyer have tracks over them and around them. And I know all of those, right? So I'm going to go through these slides to let everybody know that the disclaimers that have to be made are made. There are the learning objectives that I gave. And I think you have to see that I don't have any financial relationships. And those are my accreditation certifications. This talk as Dr. Olivares was saying earlier, is different from the evening talk, because I want to move from the individual to the structural, right? I'm going to start at an individual level today and talk about racism. I said the word, it's in the room. We're going to talk about it. We'll be okay. And then I'm going to move to the structural, some tonight, some this afternoon, and then later this evening. So those are my financial disclosures. First of all, let me congratulate you. I'm not coming to write on an empty slate. Right? I recognize that I walk in the room in a place where people are already celebrating your 75th anniversary. You're already reflecting on the past, the history that brought us to this place and the problems that we're going to discuss. I want to congratulate you. I want to recognize that there's a DICE board here already doing important diversity and inclusion work, that I come alongside the department's existing work as well as the School of Medicine's work. So I don't arrive with the answer, certainly, and not with the only voice that cares deeply about the issues that I want to talk about. What I hope today, though, because I learned in the short time that I've been here that Frederick Douglass is buried here. So is Susan B. Anthony. This place is like, I want to drink as much water as I can while I'm here. There's something in the water here. I want to talk about what Frederick Douglass called the race problem when he gave a speech at Bethel Literary Historical Society in 1890. And I'm going to use race to mean race and ethnicity, right? And I'm going to use race and ethnicity to describe lots of othered populations. So although I'm talking about race and ethnicity today, the data is best on Black, white, Latino populations, but there are disabilities and other populations I'm not speaking about, but that have similar issues, right? LGBTQIA+ populations, right? Disabled population, immigrant populations, right? So I want us to think broadly about the way in which some of the history and current problems affect health outcomes, right? Although the data is best, and I'll be focusing on it from a perspective of race, and the race problem is very real in the United States. Why is it real? Well, I am a lawyer, so I have to do one piece of constitutional law. That's what I teach. And I want to talk about the 13th Amendment. How many people know what the 13th Amendment does? Even if you don't know what it says, you know what the 13th Amendment does. By show of hands. Oh, no, okay. All right, so the 13th Amendment ended slavery, right? It's the one that said you cannot make people work for no money whatsoever, right? And if you read it, it basically says the things you would expect it to say. Congress can make no law, that and states can't continue to have laws that make people work for free. You can't do that anymore, except there's this clause that says we can do it if they were convicted criminals. Another talk, but boy, that's a big loophole, right? All right, but that's not what the original 13th Amendment said, right? The 13th Amendment that you really knew sort of conceptually what it meant, even if you didn't know the terms of it. The original 13th Amendment said the exact opposite. That's really important, right? The original 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution said Congress could not abolish slavery, right? And the reason this is important, and not just a historical footnote, is because it was called the Collins Amendment. It passed both houses of Congress in 1860, right? So there were a 2/3 vote in the Senate, in the United States Senate, and a 2/3 vote in the House said that this should be the constitutional amendment. And more than that, 6 states ratified it. And the only thing that tells us, the only reason we don't know whether this would have become the version of the constitutional amendment is because the Union fired on Fort Sumter and the Civil War began. So we didn't finish that conversation. But even the Great Emancipator, do you know who the Great Emancipator is? This is more fun than I thought I was going to have. Actually, Abraham Lincoln is called the great emancipator hitter, right? He spoke in his second inaugural address about this version with approbation. He said this was okay with him. Why is that important? Because the health problems that we are looking at today, in my view, in my estimation, reflect the ambivalence that we have about race and ethnicity from the start of our country. Right? From the start of our country, we aren't quite sure, historically, constitutionally, politically, and socially, we aren't quite sure that we want this thing called equality, even though historically we started our country with that ideal. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, right? We weren't thinking about the women. We certainly were not thinking about those savage indigenous populations. And we weren't thinking about dentured whites that did not own property. We weren't thinking about African Americans. We weren't thinking about immigrants. The equality is one that we have not yet perfected, right? And that matters because it's still showing up in our health outcomes today, right? If you haven't seen the 2003 report, it's a very old report. It's been replicated over and over again, but it is the report that tells us that over 600 studies at the time that it was the Institute of Medicine. It's now the National Academies of Medicine. At the time that this consensus report was done, it showed us in a literature review of over 600 peer-reviewed journal articles, right? That no matter what setting healthcare was delivered in, right? All of these diseases showed a similar pattern: disparate outcomes by race and ethnicity as a result of disparate access to quality of care by race and ethnicity, right? And we saw this over and over and over and over again. This is not a new problem. This has been described. And let me assure you, because I looked briefly at the 2021 equity report, that you have that problem right here in Rochester, right? You have that national disparities problem in Rochester. And the way I know it, I don't even have to read the whole report. This is a map that shows the segregation concentration in the city of Rochester, right? Down in the red, 40% or greater of the population is minority, African American, immigrant, Latino population, and they're all concentrated in one area. Do you see that? Segregation is alive and well in Rochester. Don't feel special. It's alive and well in America, right? And I want to tell you that that is a causal, I know I'm going out on a limb here, but that is causally related to the health disparities that your patient population of underrepresented minorities are experiencing, right? That place matters. These are just a few of the data. I could go on and on. I just want to make it relevant to your geographic area because the rest of my data are from different parts of the country. But I just want you to know that what I am describing nationally is occurring here in Rochester with respect to health disparities. And I would posit to you that the same explanatory variables are highly correlated with the problems of health disparities here. Here I'm showing just age-adjusted potentially preventable hospitalizations. Rochester, predominantly minority, the city of Rochester, as compared to Monroe County, New York State overall, and excluding New York City because of the high population of underrepresented minorities, and infant mortality. Just two indicators. We could do the same thing over and over and over again in Rochester that we do nationally. Cardiovascular disease, transplantation, asthma, diabetes, and so forth. Are we on the same page in terms of the problem that we're describing? I'm just describing the problem at this point, right? The reason I am not, I want to get the big elephant in the room out of the way. The reason I'm not calling this a socioeconomic problem is because they overlap, but they do not overlap perfectly, right? The reason I want to call this a race problem, like Frederick Douglass, as opposed to saying that this is something that if we aimed at poverty, we would make the problem go away, I want to be provocative and suggest that is not true. We will make some of it go away, right? But there's a residual fundamental cause. This is a diagram from an article by Link and Phelan. It was published in 2000, I'm going to say 15, right? the fundamental cause of health disparities is racism. Ooh. That is to say that socioeconomic status explains some, but not all. So I am a middle-class African-American woman. I have an education beyond college. I still have a 2.5 times more higher likelihood of losing my baby in the first year of life in this country than a white woman who's not got a high school education and lives below the poverty line, right? It's not my socioeconomic status that gives me equality from a health outcomes standpoint, right? Even though, and I don't know your geographic areas very well, but even though only 10 miles separates me geographically where I live from the segregated Black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., right? I still have a life expectancy that's shorter and more like the segregated Black neighborhood than I do the white neighbors that I've been able to move into because my husband's a cardiac surgeon, right? So I convince you that the health disparities we're talking about are not described fully by a socioeconomic problem. And that's why I'm going to talk about racism. That's why I'm going to talk about race. Now, tonight I'm going to actually define racism. Today I'm going to talk more about how it shows up in clinical practice, how it shows up in your patient population. I'm going to start with implicit bias. I'm going to start with it generally. I'm going to then talk about it in American healthcare. Then I'm going to talk about it with respect to the social determinants of health. And I'm going to end with some intervention strategies, solutions that we can consider today. I have a ton of slides. So I want to tell you that 16 is the number of takeaway lessons I'm hoping to get through. I'm going to start talking much faster because some of those lessons build on one another and you don't have to linger at any one of the slides. So implicit race bias requires me to tell you a personal story about myself. It's a story about me training for a marathon. I used to be a sprinter. It was a long time ago. But once my sort of quick twitch muscles went away, I was like, oh, okay, well, we're going to do longer races, slower races. And I was training for a marathon. I've only done 2. I will never do another in my life. I was training for a marathon in Washington, D.C. And the way it works is you, you show up at like 5 in the morning, you start running, and 5 at night, you're done, right? And so I was going to my training run and I called a lift. That's how you know I'm not a real runner, right? Because I call a lift to the beginning of the training run. It was 6 minutes away. And the story is important for implicit bias because I want to sort of lay the groundwork as to what it is, right? So it's like 6 o'clock in the morning. It's just about getting light. I'm not paying attention. The lift guy comes. And this happened a number of years ago. So you can tell because in a moment, I'm going to tell you I was actually able to call Lyft to report the problem. But the guy comes and picks me up and I jump in the back of the car and I'm fiddling with all my GPS junk that you have. And he looks at me and he goes, oh, you're going to Virginia. I was in DC at the time. Virginia, Iwo Jima Memorial, where I was going to start the run, 6 minutes away. He says, oh, you're going to Virginia. I can't take you to Virginia. I'm not going to Virginia. And I'm not paying attention at that point. So I said, I'll tip you really well. I'm sorry, but my run starts in like 5 minutes. I'm really late. Let's go. And he says, no, I'm not taking you to Virginia. And I said, I bet you've been driving all night. I understand, but I don't have time for it. And he goes, I want you out of my car. Okay. So I'm a woman of a certain age. At this point, the hair on the back of my neck is starting to tingle. And I am from the South Bronx, so I'm like getting a little arrogant. And I said, you actually will take me. And he said, I have an automatic lock on my door. He says, okay. He locked the door and he started driving away. I'm thinking the South Bronx girl called this wrong. I am being kidnapped at this point. And now I go from angry to petrified, right? And so I bang on the door and I say, stop your car. And I'm, bossing him around. And here's where I decide he's a racist. I make this decision in my mind that he is a racist because he turns around and he looks at me and goes, so you want to go home with me? Is that why you want me to stop? And I thought, oh man, all my past associations are called up. I did get out of the car. By this time I'm trembling. I don't have a real retaliative action to take. I think about keying his car, but I'm in Washington, D.C. It's the most police city in the world. I'm going to jail if I do that. So I walk around and I just open every one of his doors. I have no explanation for what that was going to do. No explanation. And he just looks at me and goes, nice. And he closes it. Let me tell you, fast forward, I did the run. My husband comes because we're commuting at this point, and I was a perfect monster all weekend. I was unkind, unpleasant. I know that's hard to believe, right? I was unkind, unpleasant. And Monday morning, my husband's like, goodbye. I'll see you next weekend. I get in the car from my Monday morning. It's another lift from my Monday morning office. And I'm dressed, I'm dressed for success now. And there's something still very wrong with me. And I asked the lady, this time I have a Black woman driver. I asked her, is there any place I can report what I think is racism? Understand, he did not call me the N-word. He didn't say, get out of my car because you're the wrong color. Whatever he did that I processed as racism was implicit, right? It was totally implicit. And I made the jump. I made the leap. So she says, yes, you can go ahead and call. And she gives me the number. It's an emergency dispatch. I call the emergency dispatch. You are in Rochester, so you don't know what a good Virginia accent sounds like. I know it as soon as I hear it. And the guy who picked up on the dispatch end had the perfect Virginia drawl. And I thought to myself, this is going to get worse before it gets better. And I start trying to tell him the story, and I'm tripping over myself. Why? Because I don't have a real racist set of facts. Got in the car, the guy wouldn't take me, told me to get out. I was really mad. And I start telling him the story, and I'm thinking, this guy's not going to get it. And I'm feeling lost. When the guy on the dispatch end with his Virginia accent interrupts me and he goes, ma'am, that is not only wrong, but it is an emergency. I'm glad you called the emergency line. And then he says, if I have to stay on the phone with you all afternoon to make this right, I will do so. At that point, I just literally, I'm telling you, a grown woman in Washington, D.C., dressed for success, I just started crying. Because I'd been heard. And he believed me. And he was going to try and do something about it. 3 lessons. Number 1, your patients experience implicit bias and racism physically, right? It affects their health. The navigation that is required in order to discern whether somebody is or is not being prejudiced against you, is or is not discriminating against you, whether you are experiencing racism or not, it takes an allostatic, it has a measurable impact on your allostatic load, and your patients feel it. I felt it. Number 2, everybody's susceptible to bias. I assumed the guy from Virginia was not going to listen to me. Why? Because he had a Virginia accent. That's it. That's all I needed to leap to the conclusion that it was going to be worse than it was going to be better. And I'm the bias scholar, right? So what I want to do is just acknowledge that bias is something that's in the air. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but everybody has it. We all have it, and we have it on a variety of spectra. But in the United States, because of the news we watch, the music we listen to, the political debates we're listening to, we have racial bias, right? And I think you give better care if you go ahead and assume that you have it, right? Because it's in the air. It is environmental, right? And you don't have to be a racist. You don't have to be a bigot in order to store the knowledge that comes from living in Rochester around probably no people that look like me, right? Around people probably who mostly speak English as their first language. You don't have to be a bigot in order to store the knowledge, store the cues, and then call them up when your patient who looks nothing like you or comes in with an accent, right? Or looks like the kid on TV at the 10 o'clock news who was arrested for doing fill in the blank, right? You don't have to be a racist in order to call up that knowledge and make some assumptions that very powerfully will influence your delivery of care, right? So the first takeaway message, there's 16, I better speed up. The first one is that biases are neither neither bad nor good per se, they're just human. You don't have to be a bigot. It operates automatically, unconsciously, unintentionally, preemptively, but importantly, pervasively, right? It will preempt your conduct because bias is how we live in the world. We live in the world of information overload by heuristically sorting out information in shorthand so that we can do our lives daily without being overcome, right? So I make judgments about how fast I have to cross the street. I make judgments about my patients because that's the way I live in the world, right? So if you assume that some of these biases are good and some of these are destructive, you'll give better care because they're not the same as racism. You shouldn't think, lesson 2, you shouldn't think that they're the same as racism, but I will tell you that they can be measured, and in the aggregate, they are equally as destructive and pervasive as racism if you were a racist, right? And that's good enough reason for you and I to pay attention to it at an individual level, because that's how we're going to improve health disparities. That's how we're going to pay attention to the things that are really causing them and perpetuating them. So if you've ever seen the IIT implicit association test, have you already seen this? Okay, so I can speed through these. You know what the test looks like. You know that we can measure it. You know what the problems are with the test, right? You know that it's not altogether clear that they are measuring racism, right? They might be measuring your discomfort, right? And we're not all in agreement, although I'm convinced, we're not all in agreement that the fact that the majority of people that have taken the implicit bias test at the Project Implicit website, which you see here, you could take it too, right? Have pro-white, anti-Black, pro-white, anti-Latino, pro-Christian, anti-Arab, right? Biases. We have them. We're not all convinced. There's a minority in the literature that I have to disclose that think it doesn't control behavior and conduct as much as the majority of researchers like me think it does, right? So disclosing about the conflict in the literature, I still think that we understand how to measure levels and types, and I'm going to suggest impact. That's my bias. I believe we can measure impact, right? What does the research tell us? Well, one thing that it tells us is that bias produces differences in healthcare that are as bad on the aggregate as outright racism. Why? Schulman study, 1999. Are you familiar with the Schulman study? So the Schulman study is pretty old, but pretty common. It was breakthrough study. 8 actors, same vignette, right? And they gave basically a history and physical, and then the 287 physicians had to make a decision about treatment. They got to choose between the treatment of choice and the treatment that was inferior, right? And that study, Kevin Schulman's study, led to a very it really was a disruptive conclusion that race and gender were highly correlated with the quality of treatment decisions, right? The real breakthrough came when Alexander Green did his study, same kind of study, a set of vignettes of patients presenting with acute coronary syndrome. Then they got a questionnaire about their explicit, the physicians that participated, their explicit biases, racism, and their IAT, the implicit association test, gave them an IAT score, right? 0, -1, 0, +1, right? Low was low implicit bias, high implicit bias is 0, neutral, right? So you've got 3 pieces of information. You've got the physician giving a treatment decision, you've got their implicit bias score, and you've got their explicit bias score, right? And what do we find in Alexander Green's study? There was a correlation between implicit bias and the quality of the treatment decision. The greater the treatment decision, the greater the implicit bias score of the physician, the greater the probability that that physician would give the treatment of choice more likely to white patients than to Black patients, right? And the lower the implicit bias score, the more likely that physician would give equal treatment, right? That's our ideal, equality, right? So the results are unconscious and implicit bias was correlated with treatment, but disassociated, this was very important, disassociated with explicit bias, right? So here, with me, pause for a second. What we understand is that you can be a perfect liberal. That's your card-carrying self-identification. You are egalitarian, you are progressive, you are non-prejudiced explicitly, right? And your conduct will be disassociated with your high, implicit, unconscious, unintentional bias. You can mean well and still do what would ultimately be a racially biased decision. We have this data out the wazoo, right? I'm just showing you one or two studies. But we have, you know, the psychology terms, we have 7 chairs in the room and the college student comes in and there's a Black person sitting in chair 7 and you tell the person to sit anywhere they want and they sit over here if they've got a high score and over here if they sit, you know, you can do all, we got all of those tests, right? We can replicate those without using the IIT, right? That's important also, right? One of the most impressive studies, if you're not convinced that implicit bias affects treatment, was done out of the University of Virginia very recently, 2015. I'm sorry it's not in my slide deck, but if you want to look at it, Sophie Trauwalter, who was with me in the founding of the Equity Center, was one of the scholars on that, Hoffman, Trauwalter, et al. Right? Without using the IIT, which I understand is controversial, I don't find it controversial, but other people do, right? Without using the IIT, they did a study of third-year medical students, University of Virginia, third-year medical students, and what their biases were about pain. You know the study already? The pain study at UVA? It's a great study. I'm not going to linger on it, but it's a great study because we got 15 statements, half of which are just blatantly untrue, factually incorrect, right? No scientific support whatsoever. Black people feel less pain because they have thicker skin. No. Black people feel less pain because their blood coagulates at a different rate. No, right? And so half of them are that untrue. And what we saw was a correlation between third-year medical students' willingness to treat pain and the number of untrue biased statements they had about Black people, right? So bias has an influence. I think it's unassailable at this point. The question is, are we going to make the fact, lesson number 5, that bias is correlated with poor and inferior treatment? Are we going to internalize that in our own care, in our own hospital setting, and do something about it? More evidence that bias has an impact on the clinical encounter. Michelle Van Ryan, I think she's still at the University of Minnesota. She left now. But physician perceptions, you take surveys of physicians about their patient population by race, by immigrant status, by ethnicity. And you find that this was a study of how physicians regard Latino populations, especially women, right? Generally, they think before they get into the clinical encounter that Latino women over-report discomfort. They don't comply with medical advice. They're more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. Let me tell you something, that is just empirically untrue, right? And yet this is the perception that physicians Michelle Van Ryan saw in their a priori before they get into the clinical encounter. This one was for Black patients, very similar and very incorrect, right? So provider judgments are affected by bias before the clinical encounter begins. Lisa Cooper tells us that communication between provider and patient is affected. And it's affected both ways. I had this conversation earlier with one of the trainees, right? Let's say you're my patient and I'm your physician. And you walk in and you look at me and you're like, that's a Black woman. you get that right away, right? And you have some past associations, right? If you are the same race as my Lyft cab driver, I have already got some stored knowledge that tells me who you are. And you, my patient, sit there and your sort of discomfort is shown by the fact that you sit a little bit further away from me, you're a little quiet. And my biases say, this is a non-compliant, not very warm patient who's not going to tell me the truth. And you reinforce that because your answers to me are terse. So you don't know if you can trust me or not. I look like the last guy that did something negative to you, and you sure look like the guy that did something negative to me. So we're off to the races, right? In a feedback loop that reinforces all of our biases in the clinical encounter And what Lisa Cooper from Johns Hopkins has told us is that as a result, I, the physician, I will be verbally dominant over you. I will less likely credit what you are saying. I will discount it because you remind me of the group of people that overreport, right? You remind me of the group of people that in Rochester, they're the mostly poor people. So I'm not sure, I'm not going to ask you about your financial circumstances or your social supports. I'm going to assume that even unintentionally, you are unable to comply with the treatment of choice, right? And my communication loop with you is going to reinforce the inferiority of your care, not because I'm a racist, not because I'm a bigot, but because I live in the United States of America, because I'm human, and my bias is not my interaction with you individually is informing that. And the same with you, right? You're my patient, you're gonna walk out of it pretty dissatisfied, you're not coming back. And so the continuity of care is affected, right? You're gonna tell your friends that Dana Matthew, don't go to her. And we have a communication problem that is affected by bias on both sides, patient bias as well as provider bias. Lewis Penner tells us that the worst combination, remember I said there was in the earlier study, there was a disassociation between explicit and explicit bias, the worst combination from patient perspectives. What they can tell a mile away is low explicit bias, you're liberal, and high implicit bias, you're not fixing it because you don't think it's your problem, right? That's the people they don't want anything to do with, patients tell us, Lewis Penner, Wayne State, right? Patient satisfaction is affected, communication is affected, treatment is affected by bias. In Just Medicine, what I'm trying to show is that a non-trivial causal relationship exists between implicit racial and ethnic bias and poor health outcomes that are disproportionately showing up in minority communities. 84,000 deaths a year, estimated by Tom Leviste. And at the time, $1.24 trillion of unnecessary medical costs because we don't understand the cost of bias. Implicit racial and ethnic biases cause costly discrimination that causes patients of color, patients from othered backgrounds to live sicker and die quicker. But we can do something about it, right? Bias operates in academic medical centers, right? It operates not only from provider to patient, as I've shown, but it operates among faculty members, administrators and students, among researchers, among patients themselves, right? We're all susceptible to our faculty and student relationships being affected by these preconceived notions that are automatically called up and preempting our better angels and the things that we believe are true, right? So they operate all around us. Don't despair though. There's good news coming, but before I do, I now want to do what I said in the beginning. I'm going to move from the individual to the structural. Just let me spend a little bit of time showing that in the aggregate, these biases actually have a bigger impact on what happens to your patient's social setting, right? Than even what happens in your clinical setting. I think it's important. I'm going to give you some tools to address it in your clinical setting. But if you remember, the social determinants of health have a far larger impact than what happens clinically, biologically, right? Even behaviorally to patients. That large dark blue slice is the social and economic factors that affect patient outcomes, right? Residential segregation used to look like this. It used to look like this. Redlining, you know all about redlining. Today, we know from national surveys that housing discrimination takes a different look, right? When I come to Rochester, I'm going to get a realtor and I am going to dress really professionally. I'm not going in my sweats because I want that realtor not to steer me to the dark red places in Rochester. I want that person to steer me to the light yellow places, right? But if I don't dress properly or I'm not that well educated, the likelihood that I see the same houses that the rest of us see, not high, not 100%. Or the same apartments, not 100%. It's subtle, but the apartments that are populated by the people living in the dark red places in Rochester, yes, they have housing. So if you do your you're screening to see if you have stable housing. Yes, they have housing, but the defects in their housing disproportionately affect, and this is, if you are a researcher, this is very old data and I cannot find an update for it. The disproportionate representation of Black and brown people in substandard housing with severe defects, right? That's a research problem that we don't have enough data to address. But when I got this 2011 rather, the housing survey, moderate to severe housing defects disproportionately affect Black and Latino communities as compared to white communities by income and by race. And I bet that's true in Rochester. Not just that they have housing, but do they have lead paint? Do they have heat consistently, right? Are there structural defects? Are there roach infestations? What is the proximity of the housing that is available to pollution sources, right? Interstate highways, power plants, waste distribution centers. When I started looking at this, it was in Colorado, and we were looking at a Latino community of 40 years, 4 generations of people had lived in North Denver. And the reason I got the case was because the Department of Transportation was getting ready to put the not first, not second, not third, but 4th interstate highway through this historically Latino neighborhood, right? And we were trying to sue them under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, saying, no, there's a white neighborhood right down the street, put it over there. Right? Put the 4th highway over there, right? The compromise that was offered by the Department of Transportation, and this was in 2016, not that long ago, we will move it right next to the elementary school and put a concrete cover over it. Yeah, that's the right reaction, exactly. So where you live, right, if you're white, and where you live if you're Black is it's not just that you have housing, it's the quality of the housing that is at issue also. Let me just say affordability is another issue, right? So if you and your family look at your budget and decide how much of your budget you're actually spending on housing, probably 30% or less. We have great data that tells us Black and brown populations, I don't know about in Rochester, but nationally, are likely spending more than 30%. And when it's as much as 50% to include utilities, what suffers is children, right? Children get less good food, less good education. And so when you're screening for housing, if you're not screening for affordability, you're really not looking at the problem that produces health disparity. There's a deeper look that I'm suggesting. Housing is an important determinant of health. You know what? I think I'm going to save this slide and tell the story tonight. But just a sort of preview of coming attractions. This is that flight that went down on the Hudson. There are 2 groups. The one in the front, they look like they have a better chance at living than the one in the back. That's Rochester, right? Everybody's got housing. All 155 people got out. But some of them are living in segregated areas that inform whether they get a good education. This is what education discrimination used to look like. I don't need this anymore because I have a totally segregated Rochester, right? I don't need this person yelling that you can't come to my school because we pay for education by property taxes and they're located in a totally segregated Rochester. All I have to do is put them in the right neighborhood and they are going to, in fact, graduate at a lower rate, have worse teachers, have less access to IB and AP education by race and ethnicity. It's the most efficient form of discrimination you've ever seen in your life, right? And not only are those people who live in the segregated parts of Rochester going to have worse educations, they're not going to get to go to school for very long as they would if they were white, because the discriminatory disciplinarity disparities start at age 3. Latino American, and Black boys, Yale study, can do the exact same thing in a preschool classroom that a white kid did. And they will be labeled a behavior problem and get started on the juvie referrals, while a white kid will go to treatment for autism much more frequently, right? Education achievement gaps are not a surprise when that happens, when disciplinarity, grading, tracking, and so forth is different. Adverse impacts on education are the result of bias. Segregation does that to food security. This is what it used to look like. You used to have to sit at a counter and get food thrown at you. Not anymore. Food insecurity is geographic. If you looked at the data, this is another determinant of health. Criminal justice disparity used to look like this. It doesn't look like this anymore. All we have to do now is look at marijuana use. It's about the same between Black and white people. But the arrest rate for marijuana violations, possession, vastly different. Same behavior, policing very different. Law enforcement bias. Oh, this one's horrible. I don't even want to do this one, right? In the United States, I'm sorry, in New York City, stop and frisk stops are taped, body cams, and coded by researchers to see how often police use hands, push people into walls, use handcuffs, draw weapons, push people to the ground, just the quality of the stop, right? Very, very different for Blacks than it is for whites. So the data is there. The question is, are we connecting it to health outcomes? And that, I think, is your job. That, I think, is your job, to understand that the environment in Flint, to follow the example of Dr. Mona Hanna-Attish, who sounded the alarm for elevated blood levels in Flint, Michigan, experienced a great deal of derision, actually, right, before anybody listened to her, but said this population, which is majority Black, majority poor, is not being treated humanely. And the health problems that are going to result, that was her purview. She became an ally to say that this water is not drinkable. Now, understand the people themselves had said it. I'm shifting to what can you do at this point? The people who are drinking this water said, we don't want to drink this water, right? People of Flint, Michigan said, we want our democratically elected government, not the one that the emergency managers have appointed. But it's when Dr. Mona, we call her Dr. Mona, I was working in the office for the senator for the state of Michigan at the time that the water crisis was declared, right? We called her Dr. Mona. When Dr. Mona became involved and made the link between the disparate access to clean drinking water, the proximity to the Genesee County power plant, and her children's health outcomes, that's when the United States Congress took notice. And when you get involved, because you see these social determinant disparities as health issues, not just civil rights issues, but you see the civil rights issue as a health issue, that's when things change, both on the individual level and on the structural level. That's your patient right there, right? And the way that the patient is getting the treatment that the patient is getting is because we, the lawyers, can't do it alone, right? We, the lawyers, look at that water and we think, that's okay. But you have the data to tell us it's not. You have the health impacts of disparate treatment in housing, in education, in food security, in environment, all of that. You have the data to show it's not, right? So achieving equity is systemic. It's not something that we can do just with you doing good medicine. My contention is social environment will beat your good medicine every day of the week and twice on Sunday, right? You send a kid home with albuterol and nebulizer and all the steroids you want. But if they are in a house that's not up to code because there's pest infestation or lead, your stuff's not working, right? And so what we have to do is recognize that our biases are reversible. We can address them. That's the good news. The Alexander Green study told us not only that there was a correlation between poor treatment choices and bias, but also the 67 of those physicians that he isolated, remember in that study Alexander Green did, and said, I'm going to tell you that this is not a study about patient care, but this is a study about race and treatment, made different treatment decisions just because they knew that their biases were being tested. If you are aware and willing to be conscious of your unconscious biases, you can change treatment. Treatment is malleable. I mean, biases are malleable. organizations and individual can do. We've reached 16. What are some of the interventions? First of all, individuals can pause. Biases are something that operate automatically. It's the heuristic you use when you are under pressure. The insurance company tells you only have, what, 12 minutes to see the patient. When you're having work overload, you're in high pressure, there's a large disparity of power dynamic between you and your patient. That's when you use biases. Slow down. Understand that you are in an environment that is very conducive to the social information that's been in your environment, unwillingly and unwittingly informing the way you treat patients, the way you talk to them, your body language, the length of your eye contact, and all of this will change if you pause and slow down. Engage with people who are not like you. The guy who watches the news show you would never watch. Spend some time in the book club with that guy, those guys. Get to know people who are othered so that they become human beings to you. Subordinate yourself as an ally to the community that you're unfamiliar with. Ask them, are there intermediaries that are more trusted than you as a provider who could help? But slow down and recognize that you can be part of the solution. Your mindset should be humble. Boy, I'm acting awfully bossy here. I have to say, I have to do the same as an instructor in law school. My mindset has to be awfully humble. Because even though I'm a member of some minority groups, I'm a woman, I'm an African American, I'm cis and straight. I have to be very humble with what difference it makes to use proper pronouns, to respect people's choice of identity. I have to be humble and take the mindset that I'm a learner, take the mindset that I have to be, if I want to make a difference, I have to be willing to ask questions and to apologize for my mistakes. It's not only individuals that can strategize to intervene for biases, but organizations can do this also. Organizations can say, if we do not make structural changes, then we will replicate the biases. Boy, if I had time, I would stay here for a long time. University of Rochester, we had a conversation about this. University of Rochester is probably the largest employer in Rochester. You want to do something about health disparities? Pay your employees a living wage. All right. If you behave differently as an anchor institution, then you will make a difference in the health disparities that exist in the city that you are a member of the community of. You will also make a difference if you change systemically. This is an experiment. I know everybody knows this experiment where there was 1972, symphonies were largely men. Okay, hurry up. Largely men, and we did something systemically to mask who was trying out for the symphony, and we got more women, right? So do that kind of systemic changes. Make sure committees are integrated. Make sure different voices, make sure you're collecting data. Make sure people are doing debiasing as often as they do at sort of privacy and HIPAA training. It works organizationally. Prime people before they walk into the room, decouple decisions from race and ethnicity. You can do a lot organizationally. The last thing I'll say, this is a stand of trees that look like they're individual because they're aspens, but aspens underneath the ground are connected to one another. And we are accountable to our communities, to one another, and partnering to defeat health disparities and the biases that generate them is something that's not a one person, one profession solution. We have to work together. Thank you.
Room. There's one here on you were excited by the notion of providers talking to legislator. How would you organize a coalition of doctors that do go to the state and federal policymakers policymakers? And how would you discuss reducing racism in medicine and society with the policymakers?
There are two ways to go at that problem. Depending on whether you want to work at the state or the federal level, clinicians have an enormous amount of power. And if you find your local clinician, your local representatives, and say, I want to talk to you about health disparities, 2 out of 4 of them will say, I can't wait to talk to you. So you could go directly to the legislator yourself, but if you don't know exactly what to say or what to do when you get there, University of Buffalo, and certainly my law school and a number of law schools have legal clinics. Any school that has a clinic that has a medical legal partnership is willing to help train providers to talk to legislators, any school. And we depend on a partnership between scientists and lawyers to address systemic health problems.
What do you think about race-based caucusing as a model for disentangling racism?
Race-based caucusing? Race-based caucusing. I have to be educated. I don't know what that is. Race-based caucusing? Can somebody tell me what that is? I don't know. I'm so sorry.
I think that.
Okay. Race-based caucusing. That's my homework. I'll have to look it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your attendance at this Grand Rounds. As you can see, you can check out the QR code to get your Grand Round survey. If you register, you'll get one in the email. Thank you for attending this Grand Rounds. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Oh, my pleasure.